in some ways, this would just be being experimental around like where the pay thresholds are.
Hi guys, I'm Lauren Daniels, and I am a junior in aerospace engineering and this year's student program chair for the Conference on World Affairs. The panel that you are about to watch will explore what leadership means to different generations. Our hope in creating this panel is that it would remind us that despite our differences, we are strongest when we work together and act from a place of understanding. We look forward to hearing more about intergenerational leadership, as well as what the different generations can learn from each other. Enjoy the panel!
All right, well, great. Thank you, and everyone. Welcome to the CU Boulder Conference on World Affairs virtual panel. You are in the From FDR to AOC Lessons in Leadership Across Generations. We would like to thank our donors and sponsors, without whom events today, like today's discussion, would not be possible. And we'd also like to thank our speakers for volunteering their time to join us today. Today, we are being joined by three incredible people. First of which is Eddie Moore Jr., who has been a lifelong advocate and leader in academia and business, bringing in important voices and understanding of diversity, privilege, and leadership. Dr. Moore founded the White Privilege Conference, which has become a top international conference for people to move beyond dialogue and take action around issues of diversity, power, privilege, white supremacy, and leadership. He has also founded the Privilege Institute to further a new inclusive forms of research, education, action, and leadership. A renowned author as well, with titles such as The Guide for White Women Who Teach Black Boys and Understanding and Dismantling Privilege, Dr. Moore is a scholar and leader helping to change our generation and generations to come. We are also joined with Hugo Lauren, who is the recently retired ambassador of Afghanistan and Honduras for the US State Department, and soon to be published author talking about his diplomatic experience. Mr. Lauren has been on the forefront of international diplomacy since 1981, serving as the Deputy Director of the Office of Economic Policy, where he helped to launch the FTAA negotiations, a principal advisor to the President and National Security Advisor, and other notable positions within government. As an ambassador, deputy chief of mission, faculty advisor, and more in the US State Department, he has been a part of and seen American international leadership firsthand and brings a broad perspective to talk about leadership on all governmental levels. And finally, we are being joined with Kim Patel, who has been a leader in her field as her passions have driven her to be a community advocate for women and people of color in business. She supports other future leaders through providing resources and expertise in strategy, finance, operations, and more as an advisor and an investor. As the youngest corporate director at Vice and youngest person in most boardrooms throughout her career, it is no surprise that she made the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. As a first-generation American Indian woman, she utilizes her role to enable the success of others. Outside of work, she's a board member for Women in Innovation, which improves networking and success for women in tech, as well as the Brave House, which provides legal and community benefits to young immigrant women. Now we're going to move in to letting all of our speakers introduce themselves. And real quick, I do want to remind the audience that during the course of this panel, please feel free to submit questions you may have to the Zoom Q&A or the YouTube chat feature if you are joining us on YouTube Live. If you are a student, please let us know where you're zooming in from as well, since we are spread across the world today. And you can go ahead whenever you're ready, Mr. Moore, or Dr. Moore, sorry.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Please, Sierra, call me Eddie. What's up, CWA? I am happy to be here today. And I'm gonna just talk a little bit about my journey, my thoughts, who I am, what I'm all about when it comes to this topic of leadership. Just quickly, I'm originally from Florida. I did all my education in the Midwest, in Iowa, specifically. I worked in New York City and Seattle, Washington. Now I live in Green Bay, Wisconsin. My entire career has been in education. I started out as a school teacher, a coach, and I then moved into higher education as an administrator around diversity issues, leading organizations in reference to their diversity and inclusion initiatives. And then I went back into K-12 to do some of that same work, as I said, in Seattle, as well as Brooklyn, New York. Now, living in Green Bay, Wisconsin, I run my own organization called America and More. So I'm a public speaker. That's what I do for a living. But I also have a nonprofit called the Privilege Institute. I'm the executive director, the president. One of the main things that we do as part of the Privilege Institute is the White Privilege Conference, as mentioned by Sierra as well. And that's 1,000+ people every year coming, gathering. And I mention all of those just because in all of those different situations, I'm playing a major leadership role, and I have been for my entire career. And I've learned a lot. And most recently, I've been trying to just think about my life's journey around this topic, and what it means and what it's all about. And if I was talking to a group of young people, what would I be saying to them? What do I wish I had known at their age that I could start to work on? And that's some of what I want to talk about today. I think about leadership, and the way to remember my key kind of philosophy is with the acronym LEAD, which is basically the four letters, the first four letters of the word leadership, which is actually a word lead, and it's a good way to remember. Okay, so these are the lessons I would share with you as I've been reflecting on what leadership means to me as part of my short introduction here. Number one, leaders have to listen. I mean, everybody in many cases can hear, although I want to give some love to folks in the deaf and hard of hearing community, because that's not always the case. So I will say this: most people can receive information, but not a lot of people learn the process of receiving that information. And so it's a real art to be able to hold back, to suspend judgment, and really receive what it is someone is saying. And for me, leaders listen, or they have a skill that allows them to receive no matter what's coming their way. And that takes practice, that takes training. Secondly, leaders educate themselves. You gotta read stuff, you gotta participate in stuff, you gotta attend stuff. Leaders gotta be always educating themselves. Thirdly, you gotta adjust, because things are gonna change. I think if anything has happened with the pandemic, with some of the racial tensions that are going on right here today. I mean, who would have ever thought that where we are right now is where you imagine we would be even 5 months ago, definitely 5 years ago. I mean, this is a perfect example of how, as a leader today, you have had to make some tremendous adjustments. Leaders make adjustments. Second, leaders, I mean, they are dedicated. They don't give up. I always say quitting is an option. It's just not one that I'm choosing. Okay, so leaders are always dedicated to the end. And so I've been trying to think about my motto, my role model. Who is the person that I like to resemble myself after? You know, we think about FDR, you think about AOC. I mean, it's just been a lot of time over that time and all the people that have been involved in leadership positions. You know, the thing I think about, particularly in the passing of John Lewis, is, you know, his life and his life work. I think about myself in that vein because a lot of us have been saying good trouble and all of that and what that means. I think that's actually kind of oxymoronic, good trouble. But I get the premise, but I've been really reflecting on what that means. And that's what I want to think about. That's what I want to leave y'all with, leave y'all to think about as a part of my closing to my little opening here is I think leaders cause good trouble. That often you're not, in the words of Good Trouble, the person that people always want around because you're pushing for change. You're pushing for inclusion. You're asking for open mindsets, not fixed mindsets. That leaders pursue good trouble. And for me, I think, and I want to challenge y'all to be thinking about as you set your course for the next 25 years, to pursue a course of good trouble. That's how I want to spend the rest of my life. And that's some of what I'm hoping we can have some conversations about here today. So Sierra, that's a little bit about myself, my opening. I'm gonna pass it to the ambassador, my new good friend, Ambassador Brother Hugo. What's on your mind for your opening 7 minutes?
All right, thanks, Dr. Eddie. Look, in terms of a little bit about myself, as Sierra mentioned, I spent 36 years in the Foreign Service. I'm originally from New York City, Forest Hills in Queens. I'm a city kid. You know, maybe, I spent about the last 20 years of my career in very senior leadership positions in the State Department, as Sierra mentioned, but, you know, I was, in our business, to be a chief of mission is sort of like being the captain of a ship. So I had 2 chiefs of mission jobs in consulates general. That was in both Vancouver, where I was the consul general and the principal officer, and managed a team in Vancouver, managed a team in Sydney, Australia. So I was chief of mission there. And then, as Sierra mentioned, I was the deputy ambassador, deputy chief of mission in Argentina, Buenos Aires, and in Madrid, Spain. And I also was in the National Security Council, where I worked with President Bush and National Security Advisor Rice. Again, this is right after September 11. And then I was also, my most senior positions, I was, as Sierra mentioned, ambassador in Honduras. I was ambassador in Honduras 2008 to 2011. We actually had a political coup. So it was a time of constant crisis. And then, of course, my last tour was in Afghanistan, where I was the ambassador in Afghanistan. I ran the largest embassy in the history of the world. We had a staff of 8,600 people, 25 US government agencies. So that's sort of was the top of the food chain for me, to be able to end my career running what was in the middle of a war, a conflict, extremely complicated place. So I'm going to go in a very simple, some of the lessons that I've learned from those 20 years that I was in leadership positions in the US diplomatic service, as a crisis manager, as very much an expeditionary diplomat. I'm going to go into some basic things I feel are important in terms of being a leader. And I don't think these things change that much. I think they're pretty universal. That's kind of my sense that I would take from the 36 years that I spent in the Foreign Service, from the Cold War to the period of the War on Terror. But I would say, the first thing is that, leadership is an art. It's not a science. And I would say that leadership is about getting people to use their full talents to achieve common objectives. And I would also say that a leader is a completer. The role of a leader is to see that the team successfully carries out the functions needed to complete a specific mission. So a completer. I also very much agree with Eddie that a leader has to be a great listener. I mean, if you are not listening to your people, you are lost as a leader. You're walking blind in an organization. I also believe that one of the things I learned from some of my mentors is that one of the most important qualities of a leader is that he or she have strong values. In any community, people come to have shared values concerning, what's right and wrong. People decide what is legal and illegal, virtuous or vicious, good taste or bad, good or bad. The leader needs to exemplify those strong values and live by them. It's not just saying it, it's walking the walk. And nothing, I believe, and this has been my experience in 36 years of diplomatic life, nothing undermines an organization more than the perception that the leadership team is unethical or dishonest. So a leader has to have very strong values and affirm those values every day. I think a leader has to have vision, okay? That's maybe what sets a leader apart from a manager, from a good manager. A leader must have the vision to see beyond the day-to-day. Leaders point us in the right direction and tell us to get going. And the leader must also be able to clearly articulate this vision to his organization or to the broader community. On a practical level, a leader has to define the objectives and the set of goals. And the vision could be something like John Winthrop talking, about America, that we shall be seen as a city on a hill, that the eyes of the world will be upon us. That's a great example of creating a vision. This is for America. I wish we could live up to those, to really being that shining city on the hill. We've got a lot of work to do. But I think a leader can also take the shared values of the community and give it clarity and articulation. And that's very much Eddie's idea about listening. And a leader can point us towards solutions to problems, okay? I see the leader also as a motivator. A leader must be able to motivate people into action. This is really an art. You can motivate people by example. There's the quiet leader, or by the way you interact with your people every day, by creating a positive attitude about the future, a sense that what you're doing is exciting and important, and create a belief that all of the people in that organization can make a difference. Leaders want to avoid the loss of confidence. Very easy to lose confidence of your people. At the same time, positive views must be tempered by a measure of tough-minded realism. I mean, you don't want to create sort of rosy-colored glass scenario. I think Churchill was a great example of that kind of leadership when he rallied the British people with his blood, sweat, and tears. That's what he promised the British people. There was no rose-colored glasses there, but he motivated the British people through his realism. Again, I talked about, leader as a manager. You don't want to get the two mixed up, as I said, but a leader you have to be a good manager. You have to set priorities, commit to institution building, assure that the system functions. You have to be a strong decision maker as a manager. In this regard, give you an example, quality of a strong leader, whether you agree with him politically or not. And I'm not going to make any value judgment. I'm a very apolitical professional diplomat. But I remember I was in the White House once working for President Bush, who had some very tough decisions to make, whether he made them rightly or wrongly. And he once told me, he looked at me in the eye and he said, Hugo, you're either a leader or you're a bullshitter. And the point being that there's no in between. You're either a leader or a bullshitter. I kind of like that line. A leader must be able to achieve unity. A divided staff is. And then finally, I would just end by saying that a leader should be a symbol for the group. And I think that, when you look at George Washington, as a symbol of America, that's an example of leadership. And maybe my final point is this idea of renewal. And again, Eddie talked about that. A leader is a renewer. You don't want an organization, even if they're doing things well, to be stuck in doing things the same way. You must be able to adapt, change, and deal with new circumstances. But those are the lessons that I learned in my 36 years of diplomatic life in terms of leadership.
Great, thank you so much, Hugo. And Kim, whenever you are ready.
Yeah, hi guys, hi CWA. Thank you so much for having me. I'm like really in the screen. So I'm really gracious to go after Ambassador Lawrence and Dr. Moore. And I just wanted to start off by starting with a quote, actually, as about one that I live by and have lived by for a very long time. For those of us who understand that sometimes no matter how tall the heel on your boot is, the barrier is so high that you need a small lift to help you get over it. They will understand that the inequalities in society build that barrier so high. Unless you do something to knock it down or help that person up, they will never have a chance. I had those things. I had a unique mother who was able to understand the benefits of education and encourage me to use that education as my liftoff. Not everyone knows that. So that quote is from Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, and it is something that I have lived by, and it's actually very true for me as well. I also had a very strong mother who instilled in me the value of education, and that's probably the only thing that's outside of my mom and my sister, and that education or that access to education made my life very different, have a very different outcome than it was supposed to have. And so with that being said, I can tell you a little bit about myself. I have not had the storied career that our other two panelists have. I'm still very much in the middle of actually trying to figure out what might be next for me. But what I did know from a very young age is that the sky was the limit. So I never really let the fact that I already did something stop me from doing something else or trying something new. And what that really taught me about leadership, and what that means is that in every context, some of the best leaders all share the same qualities. And the number one quality I've seen is empathy. And that is something that I've tried to hold on to my entire career. And at times it can be very unsustainable because you can't solve everyone's problem and you can't help every individual, especially as you try to make a larger and larger impact in your life on the communities that you serve, or the company that you work for, or whatever the case is. But you need to hold on to the integrity behind it, right? So like you yourself need to be able to be proud of who you are when you wake up every day and the decision that you made. It's definitely never going to be black and white. I think, Ambassador Lawrence can probably speak to some of those decisions that he's had to make during his career. It's never going to be black and white, but you need to be okay functioning in the gray, but understand that you have certain principles that you hold yourself by, that you have not let go. And I learned that about myself. Very early on in my career. I started off as an investment banker. I thought I wanted to be a lawyer when I was an undergrad, and instead went into investment banking so I could pay off my school loans because the college I went to was very expensive, and I put myself through school. After that, I'd realized that being in finance wasn't really the right fit for me, so I decided to go pursue a passion, but through the business lens of things, which was to work in news and politics. After I did that, I was able to transition into venture capital. And so then I have been investing and helping and working with minority founders and women for a very long time, for the last few years, as an investor and as an advisor and as a partner. And so that's really been my main focus. So, a few things about leadership that I've learned throughout the course of my career, especially working in different industries, has been exactly what I talked about in terms of holding on to your principles. But I also think that when it comes down to making the tough decisions, you need to be able to take a step back and understand that like what your decisions are will always impact everyone around you. And it's always going to be a downstream effect. So you can never make those decisions just purely based on what you want or what you need. Those days are long gone, especially because at the end of the day, your responsibility is to your employees or stakeholders or investors or whoever it is, primarily before yourself. However, if you're making a decision that is inauthentic to who you are and something that you are not proud to stand by, that is when I tell you to take a look in the mirror and realize you may not become who you wanted to be. And that's a really tough point. And I've seen that happen for a lot of leaders that I've worked for, including myself. And it's a hard lesson learned, but it does happen. But always remember that, things happen for a reason. And so when things like that do happen, you turn around and kind of pick yourself back up and you learn, right? And so failing is a big part of leadership. Being able to fail graciously, being able to do it with humility and understanding that, the world's not necessarily out to get you, but things just don't work out sometimes. And knowing that like once that's happened, you're able to pick yourself back up and keep going. And like that is also a really, really big part of being a good leader. And if you're doing it along with, if you're doing it in front of your employees, actually showcasing that humility, but also proving to be somebody who's honest and transparent goes a really long way. And so yeah.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Kim. And if all the other speakers want to start their video so we can all start to get together and go into discussion. And just a friendly reminder, because I know that sometimes we get caught up in listening to all of our incredible speakers. So just a reminder that you can be submitting questions right now. If you guys have any questions that arise from what they've touched on, anything that you know of their previous work, or anything that comes up in the next couple minutes of discussion, okay? So let's just hop kind of into it. The title of this panel is FDR to OAC, and in a little under 100 years, our country and world have changed drastically since 1933 when FDR was president. What have each of you noticed on individual levels of how the expectations and the definitions of leaders have changed? And if for now we want to go in kind of speaking order until you guys if you guys want to start responding and stuff to each other.
So I can start with this. So we're thinking about how has the definition of a leader changed now? I think one thing I've seen is that having been both in news and politics and business and venture capital and tech, like all of these things, what I've seen is that CEOs and owners of companies and those in the private sector, like they are leaders, right? We are no longer just looking to our public servants as those who need to lead us into the future. Accountability and responsibility is also being put on those people because of like I wouldn't say the electorate, but us, because of us. As generations have grown younger, as generations go on, the younger generation, millennials and Gen Zers specifically, are fundamentally focused on making sure that our business leaders are responsible, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on sustainability, whether it's on ethical labor practices, whether it's on privacy issues, and that really matters. And so I think right now it's like the realm of influence has expanded, especially due to social media. And that's not just saying like, you can just jump on Instagram and be an Instagram influencer. It's like when you go on Twitter and you think about the voices that you hear, those of those people that you follow in your feed. When you think about that, it's actually people from all across the world. Like, it's not Oprah on my Twitter. I have influencers on my Twitter from various industries that I follow because I want to hear what they say and I respect their point of view. that realm has just fundamentally increased, and only happened really because I think of the internet and what social media has been able to do to amplify voices in a different way. Sometimes they're not always the best voices, but I do have more of an optimistic take there.
Yeah, I would just, I think if you go back to the period, in the 30s with President Roosevelt, obviously the United States was facing, the Depression. I mean, the situation in the country was extremely grave, and everything that was going on in Europe was bringing us toward, the Second World War. So clearly FDR, was a person who was a great leader. But I think what has changed is just the event today. Everything is just moving so much faster because of technology, because of globalization, because of the instant movement of trillions of dollars of capital. And so that makes it so that I think it's harder in the present time. It's very easy to get in the trap of the day-to-day, the news headline of the day, the social media message you want to transmit, and you're picking up what you think is happening, and you tend to lose a little bit of this ability to look at the big picture strategically. Again, look at the example today. FDR had a vision. He had a strategic vision, both in terms of economic policy and in terms of what the world should look like. Today, if you look at our reality, and this is not meant as a political criticism because it's not, but the operational methodology of our current president is literally, he's shooting, he may be a master at the technology, but I just don't see the strategic thinking. I don't see kind of the big strategic picture of what he really wants America to be. So again, I think it's just much more demanding. Now in the private sector, you have people, and I look at some of the technology, people in the technology sector, old or young, at all levels, that are people that can kind of function at this very rapid pace and yet still have a strategic vision about the future and where you really want to go. Remember, I mentioned one of the things I learned in terms of in my career was this idea that the leader has to have the vision. A leader that doesn't have a vision, could be a very courageous, ethical man or a woman, but he's a blind leader.
Yeah. What's up, Kim? Nice to meet you. Say hello. CWA, here's what I'm thinking. You think about FDR, what that person looked like, what that time looked like, and AOC and where we are today. Those 100 years, it's just mind-boggling to think about the way things have changed, yet the way things have stayed the same. And what I think about when I think about that question, the expectations, the definition of leadership, I don't know. I look at the industries of power, privilege, and it seems like that still is ruled by an FDR presentation. And I'm just really concerned that leadership still in some ways is white, male, and not even always in that visual presentation, but even in their kind of the way people have to operate, the things that people have to learn. That you yourself as a young person, when you're looking at leadership models, you're often looking at Stephen Covey. You're looking at white, male, narrow frameworks. And you take AOC, like just the rise, the journey she's been on to get to where she is, right? And the knowledge, the creativity, the fierce, the beauty, the articulation, the strategy, yet she is one of the greatest villains painted and distributed across our society. We're not often receiving her as a 21st century leader, as the future. Now, some of us, depending on where we are, but I would argue that still what the world is seeing as the future of leadership, it's Amazon, it's Twitter, it's Facebook, it's T-Mobile. all of which are narrow presentations. And I think that's the challenge for us over this 21st century, over these next 25 years. I think leaders are often appointed. The job isn't earned. Sometimes it's based on what they look like, what their connections are. And that's my real challenge to CWA for the next 25 years. Is let's begin to reconsider what we expect out of a leader and what the qualifications are, what the definitions are. And that I think AOC should be lifted up higher as a future model of what leaders can be, what leaders can do. Now, you may agree or disagree with her politics, that's fine. But looking at that story, respecting the journey, the courageous, the willingness to fight for those who don't have very much. I mean, I feel like the people that are doing that today, particularly Black and brown folks, and especially women of color, aren't often the sheroes or models of leadership. They're often painted as the villains. And that's what I feel like we need to change when we talk about expectations and definitions of leaders. And why I'm happy that we can be here in this conversation and presenting for CWA, the young people in this conversation, some new ways of considering who your leadership model is, why that leadership person, why that person is your model, and would you be willing to consider someone like AOC? And why wouldn't you? Why aren't we seeing her represented more and more as the future of leadership? And I think that that's going to be something I'm going to be watching and hopefully participating in as we grapple with the definition and the expectations of 21st century leaders.
And I want to go off of kind of what you said, Eddie. And real quick, we just have one question of somebody to clarify. AOC is Congresswoman I'm so sorry, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and that's who we're referring to when we're talking about AOC, for anyone in the audience who wasn't sure. And she is a current Congresswoman right now who was elected in 2 years ago, about 2 years ago now. But on that, we're really lucky to have each of you here who are coming from different industries. You guys each have had different careers in very different places. And I think it'd be great for our audience to hear from each of you your experience with this, like what Eddie was talking about with this FDR type of like leadership that has constantly been there, in this very specific like white, straight, cis het male, toxic masculinity, any of those things where you guys have been seeing this in your careers, where you've maybe been seeing change, or how you'd recommend like change be coming about in the fields that you guys have been focused in.
Yeah, so I will say that I've worked for, straight white male executives more or less my entire life, in finance, in media, in the boardroom. Like, that's just who's there, investing. And I think one of the things that I will say though is, to Dr. Moore's point, we don't give the credit that's due to somebody like an AOC, and we vilify her in the media and the press, because it's really easy. In the same way we did that to Hillary Clinton, regardless of however which side of the aisle you fall on, in the 2016 election. We just happened to do that to women because it's a lot easier to do it to women. But I will say that one of the struggles is that, you can have somebody like, technically FDR and his policies was on the very progressive, kind of extreme, like liberal leftist side of things, as is AOC. I think today, because the country is so divided, it's really tough to be able to then also say that it's really tough to essentially want to just break everything and start from scratch. And when somebody brings out that type of tone, it threatens a lot of current institutions that exist. And one of those institutions is that a majority of the leaders, especially those who essentially kind of run what is our democratic version of capitalism in this country, all happen to look the same, to Ambassador Lauren's point. The question doesn't become like, let's just break it all in half, right? Because some of it does work. It becomes, how do we instill systems now that by the time I'm dead, but hopefully my grandkids are here, or my great grandkids can see a new definition of what those institutions look like. So those institutions will just look very, very different. Right? We're in something called a great experiment for a reason. It is still an experiment. So that doesn't mean it's going to work perfectly all the time, but that also doesn't mean that you take everything that's happened and burn it, because it's not all bad. And I think that is where I have some difficulty when I see folks, just kind of want to like start. That's why I have some difficulty when I see AOC kind of turning things on its head, when she hasn't been the most well-versed. She hasn't consulted the experts. Like, there are reasons why these things are in place. When I was working, and I think a lot of this, to be very honest with you, maybe I would say something different right now if I didn't work for media executives in New York City, and like I'm in boardrooms with some of the top media players in New York, with folks like the Murdochs, or when I was working at JP Morgan with high-level executives, across major M&A transactions that's buying and selling companies. I'm not saying that it's right that like there's a bunch of white guys in that boardroom, and I'm not saying that it was right for me to be the youngest and the only person with a tan skin tone to sit in those rooms. It was not easy. It was actually extremely difficult, some of the most difficult situations I've ever been in my career. What I will say though is that is what the world looks like. And so either we can learn how to change things from the inside, which is what I've dedicated my career to doing, or you could just go run out and break things. And I think in the world, you kind of need both. You need both people. You need both people because better ideas come from debate. And so for every person like me who grew their career within the system and had to work for leaders who are part of the system, you understand how the world currently works. And so then you figure out how to fix those tools in kind of an incremental manner. It's not the best thing, it's not the fastest thing, but it's something. And then you have the folks who want to just, start from scratch, and they have some merit there. So we need to find a happy medium. And that's like kind of the way that I look at it.
Yeah, I would say that, I think the whole struggle of America has been a struggle for freedom from the very, very beginning. Highly imperfect. I mean, our history has its good side. It's some terrible aspects to our country, but I think overall we still represent kind of this hope for humanity. This country where people came from all over the world. We're a totally multicultural, multiracial society that's living within a democratic system where there's high quotient of freedom. And the idea is really, how do you translate that into positive action? Clearly, where we are now, there's a high degree of dissatisfaction across the political spectrum. And we know it. That's just look at the political leadership. And that the system has failed, the intermediation. So I would mention that. Let me just go back to my own experience. I'm the oldest person here on this panel, but as a Foreign Service officer, I was talking to Syria and Eddie at the beginning before we got online. And when I joined the Foreign Service in 1981, the US Foreign Service was the ultimate place for privilege. It was literally pale, male, and Yale. When I joined the Foreign Service there, I'm a Hispanic, women, Hispanics, African Americans, we were a tiny, tiny, tiny minority. Eventually, through the 80s and the 90s, there was opportunity. They allowed more minorities to come into the Foreign Service. But the reality is that when you look at where we are today, the number of ambassadors, there are right now of something like 200 US career ambassadors. There are only 3 Black ambassadors and 3 Hispanic. So clearly, again, has the system failed? Yes. Yes, if you compare it to the Foreign Service that I joined that was all male and white, we've come a ways, but boy, we are still in a hole. So in other words, as an old guy, I'm a little bit angry about this. As a leader in the Foreign Service, we've created a task force in the American Academy of Diplomacy to deal with this. But now it's time to kind of maybe throw some rocks at the system. We really need to radically change the way the culture of the Foreign Service works, so that the glass ceiling hits. It didn't matter what we had, Madeleine Albright, first woman Secretary of State, Colin Powell, Hillary Clinton, or Condoleezza Rice. At the end of the day, the culture of the Foreign Service continued to maintain that glass ceiling. So I'm one who I'm an establishment person. I've done very well for myself in my career field, but I shake my head. And I'm kind of sympathetic to not necessarily politically. I'm not expressing a political view, but I respect people like AOC. I do think that we need to listen to young people a lot more, okay?
Yeah, and I want to just reference AOC just because she's in the title, but I'm willing to come away from her for this question because I'm not feeling like we're looking at systemic failure, that the American experiment is not failing at all. It was designed by white people for white people. And if you look at who's doing best, particularly in the power structure, it's white people, particularly white males. Actually, the smallest part of the American population that amasses the greatest amount of wealth and opportunity and disparities. And I'm not talking about in the political realm where we have these divisions. I'm talking about, you take Silicon Valley as an example, where it's supposed to be more progressive, more open, more inclusive. You look at the last 25 years, and again, it looks like what the nation looked like in 1960 from a power structure standpoint. And so I just feel like if we're gonna be making progress that's different, then we have to name white supremacy, white male culture dominance, cisgendered, narrow, that we can't be happy with plantation diversity anymore, which is a few people of color here and there, succeeding here and there, yet the power structure not only stays the same, but the gaps are widening. The disparities, you take Bezos, Amazon as an example, and some of the greatest crisis the nation has ever seen, pandemic, he's had some of the greatest wealth accumulated. Now, I don't know Bezos. I don't know what kind of guy he is. I don't know if he's a good guy. I'm just saying that structure, that model continues in America. And if we're going to be talking about leadership from FDR to AOC, that we have got to name white supremacy, white male culture dominance, and its ever presence and its growing impact in order for us to begin to chip away. And I'm just saying, let's see what different could look like. And the only way we're going to do that is if we name that the reason these disparities exist is not because they're smarter. It's not because they work harder. It's because of systemic design. And I feel like for CWA, for this younger group of leaders on the horizon, that we can't let them, I refuse to let them just fall in line with the way things have always been. And I don't know if that's gonna make a difference, but I do think, as Sister Kim mentioned, every environment needs somewhat of an agitator, so to speak, and I'm happy. I'll volunteer. I'll be that person. But I don't think we're in disagreement. I'm not feeling like she's disagreeing with what I'm saying, and she's not, and I get it. But I do feel like somebody's got to be there to name it. And America and American leadership has been white male by colonization, by destruction. And if we're going to see a better America, something more comprehensive moving forward, I think in order for us to truly make transition, make repair, that we got to name that and build and develop and be really intentional about moving forward, and not let the kind of things that happen when we see some budding kind of leadership like AOC get labeled as villain. And again, we can disagree with her, but I think by the way she gets characterized, doesn't allow more young women of color, more girls of color to desire to be in that position, if that makes sense. And so that's really where I think some of our work lies as we look at the future of leadership. And I'm just happy I can just be a part of this conversation.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. And we're going to be moving more into audience questions. So this one is specifically for Ambassador Lauren. And also if you guys, other panelists have something that you want to add into the question that's directed at just one person, feel free, but try to keep it shorter just because we have about 20 minutes left in our panel. So Ambassador Lauren, somebody, Conrad Gregor, sorry if I mispronounced your name, sir. What advice do you have for President Trump on his leadership?
Look, again, I'm so programmed to avoid the political stuff because that's what I've done. A U.S. diplomat, what we do is we are very zealous about following the instructions of our president. I mean, because we are also swear by the Constitution to uphold the system, and the president is the elected leader of America. He's the chief executive. He has oversight over foreign policy, the execution of foreign policy. So I want to be careful, but I do think that I'll mention this idea that the leader is a unifier. So I'm not going to criticize his particular set of political ideas, but I think that, you could be a populist of the right, you could be a populist of the left. I don't think there is any problem with populism. America has had populists. Andrew Jackson was a populist. Abraham Lincoln was a populist. FDR with the New Deal was a populist. But at the end of the day, what did Jackson, Lincoln, and FDR, they were kind of rabble rousers of their time. They were a message that the elite structure found very uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, they created a consensus, and then we moved on. And I think that my criticism, again, it's not about his political views. I'm not going to comment on that. But I think this idea that he has been more of a leader of a tribe, of his tribe, against his enemies, which is a very un-American term, I think, in the political world, that your opposition is your enemy. That concept is a very bad one. And this idea, so he is a populist of the right, but who lives off the turmoil and division. And that really is, I think, antithetical to anything in terms of my experience of being a good leader. So I'm not going to give him a high grade on leadership, although I won't comment on his political views.
Great, thank you. And so Kim, this question is more about your personal journey as a leader. And they asked, many of us are still struggling with the gray area of balancing responsibility and doing what brings joy. Do you have any advice regarding how you've navigated this?
Yeah, so I think, when I think about that gray area of responsibility, it has not been easy. I've dealt with some personal and professional struggles in which I try to think through kind of not a pros and cons list, but kind of a cost benefit. I try to understand if I make X decision, if I, like kind of a decision tree. So I make X decision, what is the cost? And the cost is not always monetary. It can be very much an emotional cost, the toll it may take, the people it may impact, how it may define kind of what you're doing. So I'll give you a perfect example of this. When I was in investment banking, usually when you're in investment banking, most people continue on in finance and stay within the same industry and go into private equity. And so in private equity, you're essentially buying out companies and taking up ownership in companies and making a lot of money doing it. And I was never a great culture fit for that industry. And I never told myself the truth as to why that was the case. And so the morning I had my interview to go for a private equity firm, I woke up, I remember I had to fly on a plane to Boston from New York, go visit this firm. And I woke up in sweats, like sweating, like I was having a panic attack in my sleep because my body was literally telling me that like, this is not the right decision for you. Now, I never recommend that you get into a situation where like your body is actually telling you how much going into this industry stresses you out, and that maybe you need to find something else. But that's exactly what happened. And that morning I canceled my flight, canceled my ticket, called the recruiter and was like, I can't do this. And then looked for a job, any job in New York, and just took a different job, which ended up that resulted in me joining NBC, Universal News Group. And so I would say that decision was very much like a big major life kind of tree. If I had gone down the road of staying in finance, I don't think that I would be where I am today. I don't think I would have been able to try as much as I have. And I'm saying this in hindsight, but my biggest advice is, I don't know if I found what brings me joy for the rest of my life. I think I found what brings me joy right now. Being able to help founders and being able to create an impact and provide a very different point of view in a community that's super insulated, venture capital especially. I come from a very different background. I grew up in Jersey City. I'm a first generation immigrant. I've been working since I was 14. I put myself through undergrad. I put myself through grad school. It's just like I grew up with no nuclear family unit. It's a very different journey that I've had, but I provide a very different perspective when I'm sitting at the table with other investors. And that is my value. And that really brings me joy. And the founders across the table who understand what it takes to sacrifice to build a company know that I know what it takes to sacrifice to build a life. And so we find common ground that way. And so that brings me joy right now. But I can't tell you if that's going to bring me joy in 5 years. I know that I have a deep, deep interest in politics. I know that maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, I'm going to move to the public sector. I don't know how. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know why. But it's been something that's been ticking in me since I was a kid. And maybe I'll have a more cohesive answer. But you can't ignore natural instincts. If there is just something in you and you can feel it, it's constantly on your mind. I watch The West Wing too much, way too much for somebody who's not interested in politics, who doesn't want to pursue a life career in it. And this is one of many chapters in my life. And that's the way I think about it. You can dedicate your life to one career and that's totally fine. But I've never been like that. And when I think about how I was as a kid, multiple things always caught my attention. And I was always very curious. And I let that thrive. I let that thought back to what kind of child I was, asked my family, like what things interested me, tried to remember and like try to find those small things and let that drive me at its very core, outside of external motivations, and then in addition to that, it's also about like, what are my skills and how much impact can I make? And I know what I'm good at. I know what I'm not good at. And I try to use what I'm good at to make as much impact. That doesn't mean that it's what I'm going to do forever, but right now I'm okay with it.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Kim. And now we're going to move on to Eddie. We've got a question for you regarding AOC. And a person asked, as a diversity training expert, how do you see we shift this villain making of AOC and other women of color in leadership roles?
Yeah, great question. I think that it starts early. I mean, we see often young girls of color are criticized as being angry and angry Black woman. I mean, I think these archetypes, these stereotypes start early. And the same behavior in a white kid sees them as captain of the football team or some kind of leadership role that they're essentially associated with the same similar kind of behavior. And I think it starts early with us practicing, us noticing, us interrupting when either we ourselves are participating in that or people around us are participating in that. And secondly, don't quiet the lion inside of you, so to speak, all right? Like often I think these environments of white supremacy, white male cultural dominance, when people of color have great ideas and have emotion around their ideas or great challenges or great questions and some emotion, some real fight around their questions, which I often see AOC doing, that it's seen as disrespectful. Like you gotta deliver it in a way that's acceptable to the majority culture. And in white cultural dominance, white supremacy, it's a palatable delivery that people of color are often asked to associate and assign themselves to. And what I love about AOC is she refuses to do that. And yes, as Kim mentioned, she may have some things to learn, more details, more comprehensive study that she needs to do. But I just love the fight. And if she was white, she would have probably been a presidential candidate by now. And if she was a white male for sure, I think she'd be looked to and heralded in a very different way. And I think we can start this early when we see women of color, girls of color, just demonstrating this behavior. Let's call it confidence, competence, courage. They fight for what's important. They have strong opinions. They take charge of their destiny. All things that often don't get assigned to that behavior when it's a woman of color.
And kind of a shameless plug, but you actually have a book that educators or anybody else could read, right? Specifically regarding educating like women of color and starting that early. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have a new book coming out called Teaching Beautiful, Brilliant Black Girls. And so, and it's really not putting any commas between those words and using that one title when talking about girls of color generally, but specifically Black girls, because we've had enough, 100 years of the absence of sheer brilliance of what Kim is talking about. She brings to the boardroom has essentially been eliminated from the boardroom for 100 years because of policy, because of white supremacy. And I think what we're arguing for, if we can have, America can be in such a greater place if we open up that space over these next 25 years, next 100 years, I should say.
And on that note of making America a greater place, I'm going to kind of combine a couple of our audience questions that we've been getting. And people have been asking how we can build empathy into our own lives in order to break the systemic structures of inequality that exist. And just to kind of add into that, if you guys have advice or ideas of ways that we can, as newer generations, use our passion for diversity to foster American leadership that is going to be promoting more inclusive opportunities in terms of race and gender and sexual orientation and anything that falls outside of kind of the FDR leadership that we've kind of established. And I realize that is a very large question, but we've got about 15 minutes to unpack that and then we will be on our way.
Yeah, so I can start with that question. So I would say, like, in terms of building empathy and stopping racial injustice and just, inequality across broad spectrums, whether that be gender, race, socioeconomic status, it takes a lot of small actions to make progress. And on a day-to-day, I can give perfect examples. Where I went to grad school was a very old institution that is very much ingrained in the fact that they educated white straight men for the longest time prior to letting women into the school, and has a really deep history, right? And so when I'm talking to classmates or whoever, they just assume small things, that I grew up playing a sport, that I was able to afford to play a sport, that I know how to play tennis, that I used to ski, that that my parents had a beach house, or whatever the case is. Like, a lot of it has to do with socioeconomic, but I didn't have any of that stuff. I grew up in a city. I never played a sport. I wasn't allowed to because it was too expensive. My mom didn't have time to pick me up from basketball games or sporting events or whatever the case is. I didn't have enough money to buy a track jacket. Like, there are things in our day-to-day that most people don't realize what other people have access to. I would say one of the things that I would think about is how you interact with people on a day-to-day basis, including your colleagues at work, and also about your workplace, right? So when people are are instituting D&I initiatives, diversity and inclusion initiatives, what does that actually mean? You can see through efforts if they're actually, authentic or versus if they're just doing it for PR. Things for PR purposes can be something like, we're looking for more diverse candidates, like, apply here today. But in reality, does the leadership of that company actually understand why it's important to have more diverse candidates and what that means, and what diversity of perspective can be better for somebody's bottom line? And that diversity of perspective can help people make better decisions. And if that perspective is different because of race, gender, socioeconomic status, it's so be it, but it's about the diversity of perspective. And so I would say microaggressions, right? That's something I've dealt with my entire career. I'm sure Ambassador Lawrence and Dr. Moore can attest to that. Those follow you and they create chips, tiny chips on your shoulder that you carry around for more or less your entire life, finding ways to always prove that you can be better, that you are the best. And a lot of that really sits with especially minorities in this country. And so if you are not part of a minority group, then I ask you to really just think about your day-to-day interactions with friends and colleagues and schoolmates and teachers and whoever it is. And if somebody didn't play tennis growing up, there's probably a reason why. It's okay to ask, but it's also okay not to ask, but then also be aware. Being aware is extremely important, right? Being aware of why that might be is extremely, extremely important. Understanding when someone says, I was first generation, what does that actually mean? What is that? That means that they didn't know what the SAT was. That means that their parents didn't go to their PTA meetings. That means that they were probably helping their parents out when they were kids in terms of like the household, whether that's running it or contributing to it or whatever the case is. That means that they have to graduate college because nobody else has. That means that they can't party all the time because they need to get through school. Like there are so many implications. So I just ask folks to really think about what these terms mean in terms of day-to-day living in this country.
I would mention on a more strategic level, an example of leadership that helped create more equality in the State Department. I would cite Madeleine Albright when she became the first woman Secretary of State in 1996. I mentioned that we've got this glass ceiling against, our Black Foreign Service officers are Hispanic. But I will give a lot of credit to Secretary Albright because she kind of had shattered the glass ceiling for women when she came in. When she became Secretary of State in 1996, there might have been 2, 3, 4, 5 women who were ambassadors. I mean, I don't know the exact number. It was extremely small. The old boys network was alive and well, and women were completely excluded. And she just simply came in and just shattered it. I mean, from one day to the next, you had 35 or 40 ambassadorial nominations that were women. And I remember I was in the State Department at the time in Washington, how appalled the men were. I mean, this is like, affirmative action gone wild. And again, she didn't care. She just shattered it, imposed her will. And then we had these 35 or 40 women who are all excellent diplomats go out in the field in some very difficult jobs and do absolutely incredible jobs as ambassadors. And then it required Secretary Albright to get that done, let those women prove that they can do it just as well or better than the men. And that began the process. Unfortunately, with regards to the issue of, Black Foreign Service officers and Hispanic, we've not been able to make that progress. We sort of need another Madeleine Albright to do that. So I do think this is about leadership really managing. I totally agree with Kim, which is kind of looking at the micro level. One of the things I've always tried to do is be a mentor to all my young people. I mean, regardless of who they are, we help all. But just you see that some of the young Foreign Service officers come from a disadvantaged situation, just as Kim was talking about. So you help them a little bit more. Maybe you make that extra phone call to get them their next onward assignment, which is so important for their career progression. Give them constant advice. I'm retired, and I have a lot of Hispanic and Black officers. They're coming to me, and I'm giving them advice. I'm still trying to be a reference for them. So that's the micro. But I really do believe that in an institution, a bureaucratic institution like the State Department, you need sort of a kind of a nuclear weapon to kind of open things up.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Let me quickly say empathy to me is partly built through experiences and relationships, substantive. It takes time. I think that the more people can have more exposure outside of their closed mindset, I think that allows there to be empathetic tendencies built into behavior patterns. It takes time. I know for myself, it's happened through relationships and experiences. The thing I think about when I think about passion, don't let someone blow out your candle, especially if it gets lit while you're sleeping. That lots of who we are and what we want to be can come to us in our quietest time. But sometimes we surrender that power to other people who can deter us, deflate us. And it's just really important, especially if you get your passion from something greater than you, that you let that light shine, you run with it. I think that's really important. I heard Kim mention microaggressions. I think it's so important to think about competence and understanding words like microaggressions when we think about diversity, inclusion, all those kinds of initiatives, mission, visions, because the work has changed. Too many people, I argue, in 2020 are still relying on 1980 information. Okay, we have got to, and I want to encourage y'all, if you're going to be 21st century leaders, to operate on updated information, not outdated information. Lastly, let me say this: don't be an assimilated leader. Know who you are and be who you are. I always say, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So you might as well be damned being who you are. And sometimes these structures, when we get into them, will mold you in a way that's not you. So stand strong to who you are, be who you are. And that takes a lot of work. I know for myself, it's really taken years of really building myself and strengthening myself to be myself 100% of the time. So that's some of my thought in reference to that question.
All right, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. And kind of building on that, to all of our audience members who are still tuned in, don't let this conversation end here. Our panelists have been providing incredible perspectives and experiences over the course of this last hour, and it's important that we continue educating ourselves and working on our understanding, our ability to be empathetic, our ability as leaders outside of this panel. And even though that I know that with every CWA panel, we wish that these could last longer, especially these conversations, but all of these conversations are ones that you can be having in your community as well. You can be having these with your coworkers, with your family, with your friends. You don't just need to have leaders within these fields here with you to have these conversations being facilitated. So I encourage each of you to be taking away that from this panel, as well as all of these other lessons that our panelists have brought forwards for us today. And I want to thank each of our panelists for being here, as well as the audience for joining. And we invite you guys to complete, there's going to be a short survey once you're done with the Zoom or YouTube, and that feedback is going to help CWA. And we really appreciate it. Not that we don't appreciate it every year, but this year with our whole new format and everything that we've been having to do different, if you guys can fill out this survey, it's going to help us make the next CWA and possible farther ones that we have throughout this year even better. You also will get submitted into a raffle of sorts, from what I can tell, to win premier seat jazz tickets for the 2020 conference. And on that note, we do have preparations underway for CWA 2021. So stay tuned and know that we are not going anywhere, even with our new formats and the way that we are changing in our ever-changing climate. And please consider making a gift to CWA. The way that we function as a nonprofit is we function through all of your donations. I've sent the link in the chat that is at the bottom of Zoom as a place where you guys can go and make your donations. Unfortunately, we don't don't have the live audience, we can't stand on our feet and thank our speakers and panelists, but I know that we would all be on our feet today, right now, if we were together in person. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day. Continue to take care of yourselves and continue to take care of your neighbors.